When something happens gradually over a long period of time, often the change goes unnoticed. If something is changing incrementally, those changes are often so small that they appear insignificant or even natural, and yet those changes all add up until we scarcely recognise what we begun with. Such is the case with big government. Over the last century, there has been a steady but unmistakable slide towards bigger and bigger government. Such was the gradual nature of this change that many people consider big government to be natural and assume either that it was always this way or that big government is better. Neither is true. The most disturbing of all has been the lack of discussion on the subject. How does big government occur, and what are the implications? First off, how big is government in today's world? There is no clear way to gauge just how big government is, but there are several indicators that can give us an idea. One of those is to compare what percentage of GDP government spends. Take, for example, the United States. In 1907, the percentage of GDP spent on government was 6.6%. In 2007, it was 35%. To put that in perspective, the average individual in the United States is now governed by the equivalent of more than 5 1907 governments. Of course, the government does need money. If the government didn't spend money, how could they provide those essential protection services? Well, in 2007, the combined total spending for the judicial system, the police, fire services, and correction facilities accounted for less than 6% of government spending. And of course, government can get bigger without spending more money. Every time government passes a law requiring you to obtain permission for something like renovating your house or starting a business, the government has become a larger part of your life. Likewise, when governments pass laws forbidding you to use certain products like energy-inefficient light bulbs or even outlawing certain drugs, regulations have replaced those possibilities and government is again bigger. And so the question is, how does big government occur? Most people are unaware of the phenomenon known as pressure from above and below. In order for governments to grow, you need problems that need fixing. This is the pressure from above, problems that weigh down on society. The pressure from below is the populace demanding solutions for these problems. In the past, if there were problems facing society, they would be dealt with by individuals within that society. For example, the issue of women's rights. The feminist movement's first strategy was not to go straight to the government and demand equal opportunity laws. They instead ran a grassroots campaign highlighting the abilities of women and convincing the population that women were equally as capable as men. In the age of big government, no longer are feminist groups likely to spend time talking to an employer and convincing him to change his attitudes. Instead, they would serve the employer with a discrimination suit and trust in the power of government to force that employer to hire more women. But this is now the way that politics works. Imagine two politicians running against each other in an election. Voters observe one candidate claiming that all is fine in the world and running on a platform of inactivity. The other candidate rails against the many plagues of society, pointing out problems left and right, and offers a platform of government solutions to these problems. When society is faced with a crisis, they often turn to their political leaders. It is not a coincidence that wartime politicians are often re-elected. However, what happens if there are genuinely no crisis facing society? How does a politician get elected? We must face the reality that governments and those they govern have different interests. Individuals want a completely problem-free society with as little interference in their lives as possible. They do not like to pay taxes, but ultimately can see them as the necessary price for peace. For a politician, a no-problem society could cost them their election platforms and even their jobs. Likewise, government bureaucrats have a vested interest in as many problems as possible. For a public servant, a problem ultimately means an increase in funding for more staff and resources, which makes his job a lot easier. In fact, if a government department does a bad job one year, the next year they will be rewarded with more money coming their way. And now it becomes clear how governments get bigger. It's called problem, reaction, solution. First, you create a problem. When I say create, I don't mean it in a conspiratorial sense whereby the government actually creates problems. Most often, the government simply takes an existing situation and labels it as a problem. Politicians then blanket the media with words like crisis and epidemic. This in turn solicits a reaction from the public demanding something be done. Then they offer the solution, but only offer solutions that involve an expansion of government. It can be very disillusioning when an individual is confronted with this truth. We have a natural tendency to want to believe our leaders and to put faith in them in times of emergency. And it's not that our leaders would wish us ill. Most politicians simply believe that it is government's role to protect people, even from themselves, and big government is the best way to implement the ideas that they think will help people. However, if we are really to appreciate the truth about big government, we cannot assume that there are no pre-existing agendas at play and that governments get bigger simply because of unforeseen circumstances. Unfortunately, the model of problem, reaction, solution applies to most everything facing our society. Understanding this truth is the key to understanding big government. But what is so bad about big government? Surely, the bigger it is, the easier it is to fix any problems that might arise. This is the image presented to us, that a big, central government is practical and efficient. The reality is quite different. Firstly, big governments cost big money. In the socialist-leaning countries of Scandinavia like Denmark and Sweden, over half of the total GDP is taken by taxation. Many individuals work for 6 months of the year just to fund big government. And bigger government almost always means more centralized government. State governments are surrendering power to national governments, who are in turn transferring much of their authority to international governments, like the European Union or the United Nations. The justification is that these powerful central governments will be more efficient. But efficient for who? While the individuals directing that government may be able to implement their agenda more efficiently, this does not mean that services or protection will be provided any more efficiently. Let's break this down with a theoretical example. Imagine a local village government that represents the 5,000 people who live there. This village has an alliance with other nearby villages that guarantee joint defence programs and free trade. This is administered by a central regional government. However, all other issues are dealt with by the village governments, such as providing a police force, running the local school, and organising volunteer programs to protect the village's livestock against wolves and other predators. Because the population in this village is very small, the amount of tax required from each citizen is extremely low. When dealing with small amounts of money or resources, the government is able to minimise any wasteful spending. If an administrative error is made, it is easily traced and the amount lost will only be small anyway. But what if the central regional government, representing 20 or so villages, then took over responsibility for running the Night Watch program? It enlisted the volunteers, purchased the guns and flashlights and organised the schedules for each night. Let's say the individual running the central regional government has long pushed for handguns to be used instead of the rifles used by some of the villagers. In the sense that he can now implement this agenda, the central government is now more efficient. However, the program is actually much less efficient in actually protecting the livestock. Maybe some of the volunteers don't know how to use a handgun. Let's say the central regional government makes an accounting error and orders 10% more guns than was required, losing a significant amount of money. When an individual scheduled for the Night Watch cannot make his shift, no longer can he walk down the street to the local government and enlist a quick replacement, but he must speak to the central regional government.